adamant until the very bitter end. He was doing something new. He was not going to establish an earthly empire. He was coming to plant a church, to do something radically different. And because of his vision, because of the pathway of it, because of what he said, he died completely and utterly alone. Everyone left him.
That was your question.
It wasn't until his resurrection. And after his resurrection, that the disciples finally began to get on board that what he was saying might be true. And one by one, they bought into it. And so when you joined the church in the first century, you were joining this ragtag group of people who were defined by their fellowship, their baptism, and their community. And you knew that when you joined this group, there was a good chance you were going to be persecuted for being with them, and you might even be put to death. It stayed this way up through the 3rd century. In the 4th century, there was a radical shift in the church. And if you're like me, maybe all my life, I've blamed the heresy of Christendom, of Christian empire, on Constantine, right? He's the one who converted. He made Rome Christian. He moved the capital. I've always blamed the heresy of Christian empire on Constantine. But in researching our book, Unsettling Truths, and going more in depth into it, I found that Constantine was being discipled, was being mentored by someone, and his name was Eusebius. He was the bishop of Caesarea. And in the 4th century, Eusebius was writing a book called Ecclesiastical History, the history of the church. He was trying to do something that had never been done before, which is to write down a full account of the history of the church. It's actually a volume of 11 books. The first several books establish the divinity of Christ. Then it goes on in the later books to talk about the persecution and the martyrs of the church, and it holds them up in high esteem as these are people who are sharing the suffering of Christ. And then in book 8, he introduces a new character named Constantinius. And he talks about him in more glowing terms, which is confounding because most empires were persecuting the church, and now we have one who's much nicer. And then he introduces Constantinius' son, who is Constantine, and he ordained Constantine as a ordained emperor of Rome.
Just take this off.
Now, between books 8 and 9, there's inserted a book. It's called the Book of the Martyrs. And in this book, Eusebius talks about the worst persecution in the history of the church, which is the great persecution of the early 4th century. It was one of the bloodiest persecutions in the history of the church. And he writes down and has an account that he saw some of the people die with his own eyes, and that some of the people who died were people he knew personally. It took place in his backyard in Caesarea and in Palestine. So the persecution touched him. It was no longer an idea, something far off. He saw the results. He bore the emotions of it. It touched him. And in books 9, 10, and 11, his whole attitude towards martyrdom begins to change. And instead of focusing on the piety of the martyrs, he begins focusing on what we can do to get the emperors to change their actions. Now, if you're writing a book called Ecclesiastical History, right? The fact that you're writing the book means your book doesn't have an ending. There's no conclusion. Because the history of the church will conclude when the bridegroom of the church returns. Because you're writing the book, that hasn't happened yet. So you must know that at best you're writing an early chapter or even a prelogue to what could be a very, very, very long saga. But if we read the entire book of Ecclesiastical History as it's told by Eusebius, and we get to the last section, the last paragraph of the last chapter of the last book, this book is called Eusebius, the victory of Constantine and the blessings under him accrued to the whole Roman world. It says that at that same time they celebrated and extolled their First of all, God, the universal king, because thus they were taught. Then they also celebrated the praises of the pious emperor, and with him all his divinely favored children. The supreme God granted from heaven above the fruits of his piety, the trophies of victory over the wicked and nefarious tyrant with all his counselors and adherents. He cast prostrate, not at the feet of Christ, but at the feet of Constantine. You see, according to Eusebius, ecclesiastical history has a conclusion in the 4th century. And the conclusion is not the salvation that comes through Christ, but the salvation that comes to Rome through Constantine. You see, once the great persecution touched Eusebius, and he decided he no longer liked this new paradigm of suffering that Jesus brought in. He no longer liked the idea of a church. He wanted a physical empire, something he could touch, something that could keep him safe. He decided to plant the heresy of Christendom into his mentee, Constantine. And if you're writing a history of the church, and your goal is to create a Christian empire, you have a huge obstacle to get over, which is Christ, right? Because Christ was adamant he did not come to create a Christian empire. He came to plant a church. And the barometer of the church was not prosperity, but suffering. And so if you want to change that, you actually have to address Christ. And so if you're writing an ecclesiastical history, the way you deal with that is you write Christ out of the history of the church and you insert Constantine, which is exactly what Eusebius did in his book, Ecclesiastical History. His next book, The Life of the Blessed Constantine, was flat-out heresy. Chapter 4 was titled How God Honored Constantine. Chapter 6 was titled He Was the Servant of God and the Conqueror of Nations. Chapter 7 was titled He Conquered Nearly the Whole World. What did Satan promise Jesus if he would bow to him? The whole world. Chapter 18 was titled How While He Was Praying, God sent him a vision of a cross of light in the heavens at midday with an inscription admonishing him to conquer by that. And chapter 29 was titled How the Christ of God appeared to him in his sleep and commanded him to use in his wars a standard made in the form of a cross. Now there was another person who Christ appeared to after his resurrection, right? So Constantine claimed he saw a vision, and Christ appeared to him in the vision and told him to conquer under the form of a cross. Well, there was someone else who saw a vision of Jesus, which was Paul, right? He was traveling to persecute the Christians, and Jesus appeared to him on the road, blinded him, and asked him what he was doing. He sent him stumbling into the next town, let him sit there for 3 days, and then sent Ananias to him to prophesy to him. And Ananias told Paul that he was now going to be the apostle to the Gentiles, and that he was going to suffer greatly in this work. Now, why? Was Jesus punishing Paul for what he had done? No. What was the new barometer? Suffering. So if Jesus told Paul that he was going to suffer in his discipleship, he absolutely would have told Constantine the exact same thing. Now, Constantine may have seen a vision. I'm not going to say he didn't see a vision, but I promise you, I guarantee you, I am absolutely 100% positive Constantine did not see a vision of Christ. Christ would never have appeared to someone and told them to go out and conquer and kill under the form of a cross. That never, ever, ever would have happened. But that's the story he told. And that's what got bit. That's what got written. And so in the 5th century, the church had a problem, which is we had this heresy known as Christian empire. Constantine fundamentally changed what it meant to be the church. Now, instead of joining the church through your baptism, your discipleship, and your community, now you join the church through your member, your citizenship in this empire. Radically changed what it meant to be the church. So the theologians of that day had to decide, do they collude with this heresy or do they prophesy to it? One of the major theologians of the 5th century. Augustine is known for writing what? A just war theory. Now, a just war theory had two purposes. A, it was to help nations fight wars more justly. B, it was to justify how Christian members of these nations could go off and kill in the name of God and country, because a plain text reading of Jesus' teaching does not allow that. So you have to do some theological gymnastics to be able to justify that. So I use the fact that Augustine wrote a just war theory as proof that he was deciding to collude with this heresy instead of prophesy to it. But I want to know where he went off the rails, right? Because when you go off the rails with Jesus, he tends to call you out. So I read through his writings, I read through his teachings on the three kingdoms, or the two kingdoms, I read through his teachings on just war, and while he agreed that the kingdom of man was not like the kingdom of God, he said, but we have it now, so let's try to make it work. And then I read through his book on the correction of the Donatists. The Donatists were a heretical group. They were teaching things falsely. And in chapter 5 of this book, Augustine was asking a fairly valid question. He said, what's the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire? They had never had this before, right? They always had a pagan king in a pagan empire. For the first time now they had a Christian king in a Christian empire. He said, what's the role of this king? And he decided that his role was to prevent and chastise with religious severity all those acts which are done in opposition to the commands of the Lord. He serves him by enforcing with suitable rigor such laws as ordain what is righteous, and he punishes what is the reverse. He goes on in chapter 6 to say, it is indeed better that men should be led to worship God by teaching than they should be driven to it by fear of punishment or pain. But many have found advantage in first being compelled by fear or pain, so they might afterwards be influenced by teaching. So he is saying the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to use the resources of the state to compel, through fear, punishment, and pain, obedience to the church and devotion to God. Right? If Jesus didn't have a problem saying to Peter, what are you thinking? You're not on the side of God, but of man, get behind me, Satan. He wouldn't hesitate for a moment to say the same thing to Augustine. What are you thinking? This was never the goal. Get behind me, Satan. But no one ever rebuked Augustine that way, and so his ideas got implanted in the church. After the teachings of Augustine, they laid the foundations for the Crusades, which was about expanding the empire as well as protecting Jerusalem. In the 13th century, we have another theologian who was wrestling with heretics. His name was Aquinas. And he was asking, what do we do with heretics? And he wrote that if the world has the right to kill people who break men's laws, how much more right does the church have to kill people who break God's laws? He said it's a much graver matter to corrupt the faith which quickens the soul than to forge money which supports temporal life. Wherefore, if forgers of money and other evildoers are forthwith condemned to death by the secular authority, how much more reason is there for heretics, as soon as they are convicted of heresy, to not only be excommunicated, but even put to death? So he's arguing the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is not to kill people who don't keep the commands and the ordinances of the church. In the 13th century, we also have the introduction of this term called the infidel. This was applied to Muslims, to the Moors, later to indigenous people, anyone who didn't worship the God of the white European Christian male. This is a subhuman category. Now that we have this subhuman category, now we don't even need a just war theory to justify our wars, because now we can go to war on theological grounds. We're fighting the others. We're fighting the enemies of Christ. And so it's out of this in the 14th century, or the 15th century, that Pope Nicholas V writes out these words, and he says, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. This papal bull, along with other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, are collectively known as what we call the doctrine of discovery. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their lands are yours to take. This is the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They did not see them as human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was literally lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claimed to have discovered it. The first sentence of the first chapter of our book on Selling Truth says you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize those lands. You can't discover them unless your worldview informs you that the people living there are not human. This makes the doctrine of discovery a white supremacist and Christian nationalist doctrine that is the direct fruit of a church that has prostituted itself out to the empire. Now, the challenge is this doctrine gets embedded into the foundations of our nation. So in 1763, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he says to the colonists who are here, they no longer have the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the 13 colonies. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land, and they went on to state he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the Founding Fathers used this inclusive term, all men, is because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. A few years later, this makes our declaration systemically white supremacist and Christian nationalist doctrine. A few years later, the Founding Fathers wrote another document. They begin this one with the words, "We the people of the United States." This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. Now, if you read the Constitution, just a few lines later, down to Article 1, Section 2. Article 1, Section 2 is the part of the Constitution that determines who is and who is not a part of this union, who is and who is not covered by this Constitution. If you read Article Section 2, the first thing you have to note is it never mentions women. Now, this is important because if you read the entire Constitution, preamble through the 27th Amendment, you will find that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his. Who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by this document. Women are not mentioned a single time in the entire Constitution. And maybe you're thinking, well, Mr. Charles, that's the Old English, that's how they spoke. He referred to everyone. Yeah, you know why they spoke that way? They were sexist, right? Women couldn't vote, they couldn't own property, they were seen as property. They had no value. Old English was sexist. So Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women, specifically excludes natives, and counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. Who does that leave? 1787, that leaves white men. And technically, you had to be a white land-owning male to vote. You see, we don't think about this often enough. The purpose of our Constitution, the reason it was written, was to protect the interests of white land-owning men. A few years later, we had a Supreme Court case. It was Johnson versus McIntosh. This is 1823. Two men of European descent, they're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them bought the land from a native tribe. The other one bought the same land from the U.S. government, and they want to know who owned it. Who had the right to sell the land, the tribe or the government? The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had to determine the legal precedent for land titles. They ruled that discovery is what gave title to the land. And they go on to write, let me find this here. Discovery is what gave title to the land, and that possession, or that title, was consummated by possession. Now, because discovery might actually hint or imply that natives might have some sense of sovereignty over our own lands, they have to clarify that. So a few paragraphs later, they clarified that. They said, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. Basically, it said natives aren't human, so they only have the right of occupancy of the land, like a fish occupies water or a bird occupies air. Europeans are fully human. They have the right of discovery to the land, therefore they have the title to the land. This case, along with a few others in 1823 and between 1823 and 1830, create the legal precedent for land titles. That precedent and the doctrine of discovery are referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. I don't have time to go into all of these cases. I have a TEDx talk online titled "We the People, the Three Most Misunderstood Words in U.S. History." It goes on to examine especially the 2005 case. I can identify that it is probably one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. It references by name the doctrine of discovery, and it builds the exact same argument about savages that natives made, that John Marshall made in 1823. It just doesn't use the word. And that opinion was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, this is shocking, right? Because she was seen as someone who was fighting for the marginalized, which she was and which she did. But because land titles are based on the legal understanding that natives aren't human, this makes white supremacy a bipartisan value. In 1630, John Winthrop was on board a ship. He was in what's now called the Boston Harbor. He was here to plant the Boston colony with a group of colonists. And on board that ship, he preached a sermon titled "A Model of Christian Charity." In this sermon, he referenced the Sermon on the Mount and the phrase "the city on a hill," where Jesus tells his disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining their good deeds into this dark world. He goes on to exhort them in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. They should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. They should keep the unity of the Spirit within the bonds of peace. These are just your basic Protestant Christian exhortations. End of a sermon, he does what most pastors do, which to compel his congregants to heed his exhortations, he quotes from the Old Testament. So John Winthrop decides to quote from Deuteronomy chapter 30, the same passage we read earlier that says, "But if our hearts will turn away so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we will surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it." Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river, but in his sermon, John Winthrop changes that to vast sea. Now, why does he do that? Well, they didn't cross a river, right? They crossed an ocean. So what's he saying? Based on the model of Jesus to be a city on a hill, based on the model of Old Testament Israel with their promised lands, they are standing on the shores of their promised lands, ready to go and take possession of them. Now, who's read the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua? Right? How are the people of Israel to take possession of their promised lands? Well, in Deuteronomy 20, it says, "In the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivitites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you." I refer to this sermon as the birth of the myth of American exceptionalism. This idea percolates for about 100 years. Mid-1700s, our nation begins expanding westward. We go past the Appalachian Mountains. We go past the Mississippi River. End of the 1700s, we have the Second Great Awakening. There's a growth in churches. There's a renewal within denominations. Early 1800s, the term manifest destiny is coined. The belief that this nation has the God-given right to rule these lands from sea to shining sea. I want very briefly to look at the history of our nation in the 19th century. I made this chart. This is the history of our nation from 1775 to 2016. Every year in blue is the year our nation was in a declared state of war or armed military conflict against another nation or entity. Every year in red is every year we were fighting native nations. You see from 1811 to 1886, we had almost 75 straight years of warfare against native nations. During this is a list of some of the wars we fought during that period. We had things like the Indian Removal Act, the hanging of the Dakota 38, the Sand Creek Massacre, the start of Indian boarding schools, and the massacre at Wounded Knee. If you draw a map of our nation, this is a map of our nation in 1840. The states to the east of this map are the actual states. They're in the dark color. Everything to the west is a territory or even uncharted lands. You can look up medals of honor awarded by Congress, by war, and by conflict. And if you look up medals of honor for the Indian War campaigns, you will find that between 1839 and 1898, the United States Congress awards 425 medals of honor to U.S. soldiers who participated in the Indian War campaigns. End of the period, this is what the nation looks like. We got all the way across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. During the 19th century, the majority population balloons from 5.3 million to 76.2 million, and the native population collapses from 600,000 to 237,000. If you're doing your math, that's a 61.47% rate of genocide. If you're comparing your math, that's almost twice the rate of genocide Hitler had over the Jews in Nazi Germany. So just to be clear, between 1839 and 1898, the United States Congress awards 425 medals of honor for the genocide of American Indians and the ethnic cleansing of this continent. And we knew what we were doing. In California, in 1851, Peter Burnett, who was the first governor of California, gave his State of the State address. And in his address, this is what he said: that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying disease has broken out and we can't stop its spread, nor is he saying famine has struck and we can't feed these people. He is literally saying we can't stop killing them until we complete our manifest destiny, which is perfectly in line with promised land theology. In Joshua 10, it says, so Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes, together with all their kings. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathe, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Now, maybe you're thinking, Mr. Charles, that's a great story, but that's in the past. We don't think that way anymore. I want you to think back just a few years, 2015. President Obama was negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran. The Republicans and Israel did not like that deal. The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, came here to lobby against that deal, and he spoke to a joint session of Congress. That Congress back then, just like today, was completely divided. Weren't even talking to each other. And he had to unify everybody and get them on the same page politically. So early in his speech, this is what he said: because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. If you want to know why the United States of America has bipartisan, almost unanimous support for Israel, It's because we have a codependent relationship with the modern nation state of Israel. Has very little to do with freedom or equality. We need Israel's Old Testament legacy of promised land to justify what we did to Native people and African Americans. And Israel needs our flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify what they're doing to Bedouins and Palestinians. We have a very dysfunctional, codependent relationship with the modern nation state of Israel. It has almost nothing to do with freedom or equality. It's about justifying oppression. And in our case, even justifying genocide and enslavement.
Is it raining outside? Is that what that is? Um, I guess it's kind of heavy to think about a lot of that stuff.
It was very heavy for you the first time.
I wondered what that
And
experience was
hearing
like.
it the second time,
I
it's
said it was very heavy hearing it the first time.
black. And this time I pick up a whole lot more details. I came away with a horrible feeling,
Mhm.
an amazing feeling. But I picked out a lot more details here today. And even then I couldn't. First thing I wrote down is when you go off the rails with Jesus, he tends to call you out. And how does Jesus call us out as individuals and as a nation? I think also that in general, the myth that we have been fed of in the United States, what our nation is and who we are for and who we the people are. And it's just all been a myth.
I think it's really powerful when you see connections between all of these things. Because we might look at just a constitution or here a document or there a document, but it's one little piece of the puzzle. And he just he has the gift of hooking them all together.
Yes.
Which is, you almost need to listen to it 4 or 5 times to get Jason, I didn't get a copy of the book last week. There's the book, I don't know if there's still copies around. And is the book the best source to, I need something to sit down and look and think, sort of connected.
Yeah.
The book Unsettled Truths.
Yeah.
There's a copy in the social justice.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's one out, I was gonna say out in Memorial Lobby. Someone didn't grab it last week. But
I grabbed it last week and I returned it.
Oh, okay, good.
I reading it, it wasn't nearly as powerful as his speech. The little part, the first part that I read, it was much more cut and dry kind of stuff. He doesn't have the passion.
Yeah.
Speech does.
Did anybody listen to the sermon at the church, Riverside Church?
Oh, no.
She just did a couple weeks ago, I believe. We haven't.
No, I didn't even know.
That's kind of an entree to his next book.
Oh, right, you mentioned that last
Oh,
week.
yeah.
What did he say that was called? They call
This is the Riverside Church.
Decolonizing
Yes,
faith.
yeah, decolonizing faith.
decolonizing faith.
Yeah, I think one of the challenging things about this, and just about some of the racial justice work in general is kind of unpacking, I guess, the myth, as Julie mentioned, this idea of trying to undo or think about differently some things that are just so ingrained within our understanding of our culture, both as Americans, but that unique brand of Americanized Christianity too, and what that necessarily means about power and how we're kind of caught up within so many of these stories that it's become the water that we swim in, and so it's difficult to even know. And when fingers get pointed, or things get pointed out, there's a natural reaction to kind of push back, because it's like you feel unmoored. It's almost as if that can't be true, because that's the cornerstone of, even if you wouldn't call it that, it doesn't feel right. And I think that's a real challenge for folks. Anytime that you're talking critically about our identities as Americans or as Christians.
I'd like to go back to where near the beginning, when he was talking about women not being considered at all in the founding fathers' documents. And are you aware of a men's conference that's happening at Ephrata in January?
Mm-hmm.
Have you looked at their advertising?
Mm-hmm.
You see they want to bring up manly topics, manly things. It's very sexist. I talked to Sam Frankhauser from Ephrata on the phone yesterday about this. He and Kathy were the leaders for our trip to NOAC on the district bus, and had conversation with them. And I wanted to get his impression of that particular thing. And he's very concerned about it. He's very concerned about the Ephrata Church. He's concerned about, excuse me, what's happening at Ephrata seems to be part of a pattern of things that are happening with a new apostolic movement, as it's called. And that's part of this too. And that it just seems to fit in with all this stuff from the past.
Mm-hmm.
It's like happening now with the church, the influence of the church, of the church that this is talking about having been established. I wanted to know more from him about it, and we talked at night. And what do you do about it? How do we change, flip this mythology that we've been taught? How do we bring a different point of view to what we need to do today?
There's an apostolic church movement that relates to Christian nationalism.
Yes, that's what he was talking.
Is that what he's talking about? There's another one that focuses on men as elders, that goes the whole way back to the New Testament. It's kind of like this belief in the eldership of males comes the whole way from the New Testament up to the present, so that you're in this lineage, or in this line. And that's a different one in a sense, but it's just as insidious.
Mm-hmm.
Julie, you asked the question about how do we where do we look to for, or something like that?
How do we respond?
How do we respond? And I think one of the ways that I think is helpful, I know that we've talked about with racial justice work, has just been in the voices that we listen to and consume and elevate, and the margin, hearing from marginalized voices, hearing from different perspectives that we're used to. And part of the challenge there is sometimes it doesn't resonate because it's not in the same kind of cultural tongue or in the same type of experience, lived experience that we've had. And I think there's a tendency to, for us to speak personally for me or for, to find difficulty in finding resonance there because it's not the same kind of culture experience, lived experience. And yet, there's a tremendous amount of value that comes from widening your horizons with that kind of experience. Mark Charles, as he shared, comes from, I think what did he say? His mother was Dutch. And so he has, but he has this experience of Native peoples. And so he represents a voice that's coming from that marginalized community.
Well, I think white male voices are primary here. I've had a couple of black people say, leaders, professors say, I'm tired of saying the story. I'm tired of talking about what it's like to drive while black. I've been doing this and I'm just tired of doing it. And I was in a small group one time with some people, and because I was the one that got raising some of these issues. And he looked at me and said, "It's your turn. We'll support you. We got your back. But you, as a white person, as a male, you need to say it. You need to speak the truth, and we're there behind you." Now, I think we do need to hear from black voices and Hispanic voices. But like you said, it's in a cultural context that some people just can't hear. And that's why I think white males need to come to the fore and be bold. And how to do that. I mean, I do that. Some others of us at school board meetings, speaking boldly the truth and with a smile and with firmness. And it just needs to keep happening.
We need to hear the stories from the marginalized people. We as whites need to hear the story from the marginalized people so that then we can share it and advocate and ally.
Well, it's both and.
Yeah.
Because I've heard my gay friends say, I'm just tired of exposing my sexual history like no heterosexual would ever do. I mean, that's where I'm coming from on it. Well, we needed to hear from them to start.
So, in terms of Eddie,
Yeah.
he, at the men's group on Tuesday,
Yeah.
opened himself to questions. Black man. But then this morning he came he's here in the building. He would not come to this. Says just another sad story. I don't want to hear
Yeah.
Another sad story.
another sad story. He's tired of hearing.
Jason, what you have here, is this from NOAC?
This is from NOAC.
Okay.
Yes, this is the speech that he gave at NOAC. And there's about half an hour left
Left to it.
that we'll look at next week.
Well, we're gonna have to study his next book to see what he recommends and how to respond to all that.
Yeah, I think it's just so challenging because like he's saying, and as we've mentioned, that because it's so ingrained within the culture and the identity, that there's a sense of entitlement that comes with these things, particularly when we look at American history and think about the context for taking lands from Native peoples, and how it is very, very much was applauded and appreciated as being this important and valuable tool for American expansion across the continent. One of the, well, I don't know what to do with this except to say that it's a provocative question that's interesting to me, because when I was talking to someone about this Constantinian shift that he had mentioned in the history of the church, and how when the church became infused with an empire, kind of loses its identity as by becoming more of a tool of power and exploitation, and yet the question that I think is interesting is that this person asked, and I'm not sure I agree with it, but I think it's an important question, which is the person basically was asking, how do we understand how God works through any number of things, in that what would our orientation towards Christianity be if it wasn't for that type of historical experience? And what they were saying was, would Christianity even exist in the world in the way that it does today if it wasn't for that? And I think the answer is no, not in that kind of way. But it makes me long for what an alternative reality would potentially look like. But his question was, would it have survived? And I think people make that case to this day about America, and would America be as grand and as powerful if people didn't take lands from Native peoples? And I think the answer is no. But then the next question is, well, what would the alternative reality look?
What could those people have contributed?
Correct.
We wouldn't have the climate crisis.
And the same question, Jason, could be a whole missionary movement.
Mhm.
And I heard a comment recently said, the whole mission, they made an all-this statement, which I don't like.
Mhm.
The whole missionary movement is based on Christian dominism. I mean, the first missionary that went out, well, we need to convert the heathen because we have Jesus. Now, all our Nigerian church people would say, well, wait a minute. I mean, that's the other part of it. Now we have a worldwide Church of the Brethren planted everywhere because people are excited about this vision. I mean, it's the same kind of thing. And it's a dilemma. And
What is it that we share? Are we sharing God's love? In a way, it does not mean I believe in Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, or does it mean I'm sharing love with you? And we interact in loving ways, no matter if you're indigenous or different.
well, I saw a Church of the Brethren mission in Ecuador firsthand for 2 years. And the Quechua peoples that we were among, they knew the difference between what we were doing and what the conservative Bible believing something patronizing, and I'm using that cautiously, but they were angry at, they knew the difference, that we did it right. And we walked in partnership and we trained, and holistic and the fiefdoms of the conservatives, they understood that. They understood the difference. And I think that Nigeria was the same thing.
And I think at Brethren Housing Association, over the years, there was a time when it was, there were churches that were pushing, member churches that were pushing that we would, that women would need to accept Christ before they would receive the benefits from their housing association. That was put down. There was that push to do that.
And there's that tension in our own town with Echoes.
Mm.
And it's because of the government subsidy for Echoes that they can't do the Christian. I mean, I was in a training session one time when a couple people said, well, when do we share Christ with these people? I mean, the volunteers for overnight. That was put down pretty quick and gently. But if the government grants weren't in Echoes, Doug Lamb and his, they would have taken over. That's the safety there.
It's ironic, it's like the government's protecting.
Yeah.
And what is our government going to be in next decade?
I think Anabaptists are a little bit ahead in understanding this because we knew that both, we've suffered from Protestants and Catholics in our history. And so we have this little bit of a step back from it. We talked about civil religion, though, when we were learning about it in school, in college, when we studied church history in seminary. We didn't call it white supremacy, we call it civil religion. But at least we knew there was something going on that we didn't want to be a part of. We have a little bit ahead of a head start in understanding it, but we're still benefited from the whole thing and somehow have to figure out, well, what are the good parts that we want to hold on to, and how do we separate those from the bad parts of what Christianity has allowed itself to be used for. But we first of all really have to be honest about all this before we can emphasize the good parts.
My sense is that for many people, there was like an internal understanding or feeling potentially of that of the morals of right and wrong and taking lands from people or whatnot. And the same pushback that exists today is this culturally ingrained feeling about what is right and normal and good, but also what's practical. I think I hear that a lot about, well, we can't do that because, and you make assumptions about how people will be up in arms or MLK would have faced a lot of that too, with he's just a rabble rouser trying to be provocative, and the country's not ready for that. And so often the pushback against trying to live out in the ways of Jesus is actually this kind of civil, like society kind of saying, that's not realistic, that's not practical.
We can't do reparations.
Right.
This kind of thing.
Right.
But I do believe the truth will set us free.
Sure.
And it's painful truth, and it's going to be costly to respond appropriately. But imagine the healing in relationships that could happen if we were really honest and we really worked for healing and making things right and reparations. Worth doing, in addition to the fact that it's right.
In the long term, it's worth doing, and that's where people can't see.
Mhm.
But they
One good comment he made here was Eusebius was writing a book about Christian history, which had no ending. We don't know what. Does the Bible tell us an ending? It tells us God's love.
And it tells us the truth will set us free. And people get that concept.
Have to be able Our particular society is so short-sighted on everything that it's hard to get people to think long term.
I want to come back to who tells the truth.
Yeah,
Variety of voices.
oh, yeah.
And I listen to WITF in the morning. I get up early, 5:30, 5 o'clock, listen to things on WITF. And weekends especially, there are podcasts, Black voices speaking. And I repeatedly hear, again, as I'm gonna say it again, we're tired that Black people, people of color, speak things that are controversial, say the truth of their life, and they get cut down, they get demoted, they get criticized. It's risky. People lose jobs. And what I continue to hear is, when will white voices be vulnerable in the same way? And they're talking about white, I think male voices going to be vulnerable. I can speak and I cannot speak. I have the privilege of choosing my audience in my place.
But it's white male privilege.
Yeah.
We don't have to
Yeah.
defend ourselves or
And that's what's being challenged.
talk about what's unique about our beliefs or whatever. It's just, it's white male privilege. Tragically.
Yeah, I'm not at risk of suffering like a Black voice speaking up. What the Black voices are saying.
Although problem is, got fired for it. But, and you're right, it's risk, but we have a lot more cushion
Yeah.
behind.
All right, everyone, thank you for a fruitful discussion. We will join together for the last part of this conversation next week.